So I get asked this question a lot by people who have a K DAC and a Broadway. And they say, because the DAC has a volume control and the Broadway has a volume control. So they'll say, how do I set the volume controls on it? And I have standard answers depending on our headphones, but that's actually a really big question that has a lot that goes into that.
It's true.
And it's honestly something I struggle with at home because I got a bunch of different equipment, like preamps and DACs and everything else. And it's like switching between things.
We tried vaguely covering this before, but it is a challenging one because there's seemingly little standardization. So a lot of times the DACs will have wide range in what signal they output. And as a result, there's kind of a different answer for every DAC and amp combination.
Now, there are like videos about how the voltage and current and everything goes between all devices. That's been exhaustively explained. The water hose is the typical explanation. So I don't think we have to get into it at that level. But like practically, like how do we make it sound good with the dials on the things so that people can actually understand?
Well, I mean, some things just have a line out and it's just like 2 volts and then there's nothing to think about, right? So or volume bypass, same thing.
Yeah.
But other times, maybe you want to juice it up a little bit and it's not enough for your current amp situation, and then you want to turn line out off. So that's where the problems come in.
Yeah. So I mean, if you have a DAC and it doesn't have volume, well, that's
right.
Then your amp has to have volume, or you need a preamp.
Right.
Right. If you have a preamp, it almost definitely has a volume because
that's what it does.
That's the whole point of it, right? So, and then if it's all in one, well, it's going to have volume.
You're good.
So.
Yeah, all in one. See, that's why a lot of people like an all in one. It's like there's nothing. It's made all to work together, and I don't need to worry about anything. Plug it in, it works.
Yeah. So I guess the main one is if the DAC has a volume control and the amp has a volume control.
Right.
Then how do you set that?
Yeah, it shows we always run into that because then there's 2 knobs, right? So everybody's like, which one do I turn? It's like, well, technically you could turn either one, but they won't get the same end result.
Yeah, we don't have a K DAC here, although it does have volume control. We have the Wanla Golden Sound Edition by Ferrum Audio because it has a couple other features, like you could change voltages and stuff like that. So for the purpose of a demo, we can kind of show a bit more things, I think. But we still have the tried and true Broadway here. And we have the Diana TCs because they are unforgivingly resolving. So we should be able to hear any audio changes that happen because of it with that. Also the blue.
That's right.
It's the new color as of today, the Azure Vibes.
Just added.
Yeah, just added. Yeah.
We also have an oscilloscope over here.
That's right.
So we can look at the output of the DAC as we make changes and see how it gets impacted.
So the DAC is putting out a voltage. But I think something that I didn't really understand until not that long ago is that most audio devices in the chain are amplifiers.
Well, yeah.
Pretty much everything's an amplifier, kind of. It depends on what you want to call it. In the sense that it's amplifying a signal, everything is
If it has an analog out.
Right.
So the DAC, sometimes streamers, preamps definitely, even though it's a preamp, it's actually an amp.
Right.
It's just you can't plug a headphone into its output because it's probably looking for a specific.
This is where it gets complicated because you technically could plug a headphone into the output of the DAC. It's just not made for that. So it probably won't work well. You may not have a volume control and it may not be designed to handle that. So it might actually potentially damage it because the load's too significant. So
there's definitely a chance of it catching on fire.
Potentially, yes. It's sort of the same thing you have with variation in amplifiers.
Yeah.
You have that in DACs. It's just usually what they're plugged into isn't anywhere near as demanding as a headphone.
Yeah. I can't imagine a lot of DAC manufacturers are planning for a 32 ohm load plugged into their
Probably
output.
not.
No.
That would be an extreme step. Actually, while we were toying around with this, we had something that was making some ozone type smells.
Yeah, it got concerning.
Yeah,
we were just playing around, but
yeah. Now our oscilloscope, we looked it up, is a 1 mega ohm load. So there's no headphones or anything like that that are even close. So
basically no load.
Yeah.
Basically no load. So we should be safe plugging that into our DAC. So, but yeah. So what we're looking at is voltage though. And in general, that's what a volume control is controlling for the most part.
Generally, sure.
So it's varying
more
the
complicated
voltage,
than that, but yeah, they usually don't directly control for voltage, but yes, as a result, the voltage change is going out.
Well, yeah, a lot of volume controls, they choose to do it very different ways internal in their units, but ultimately the voltage is variable out
Right.
the output. Yeah.
It's just an easy way to visualize what this is putting out. And right now we just have a test tone going into it.
Okay. Yeah. What are we looking at right there?
This, I believe, is 888 hertz sine wave.
Okay.
So
yeah, the
it's
industry standard.
industry standard. It's not, but you could just see. Look at that. It looks like a sine wave. It looks great, and we could make changes to this and see what that actually looks like here. We can see the voltage right now. It's indicating 1.82 volts AC, and the peak-to-peak voltage is much higher, 5.2 something.
Okay, so
Look at that.
Yeah,
Whoa.
we have it set to variable right now, or non-by. This unit's called bypass. So this not bypass on. So the volume control is actually controlling it. And right here we're at about 50. So
Well, it's basically not showing up. I could change the scale here. I didn't want to have an auto range so you could see how it changes and it doesn't adjust things. So there's basically no signal there. It's very low. And you can see all the noise associated with
yeah.
the stuff interfering
But
with it.
something that stands out to me is even though we're at 50% on the volume control of the DAC, we're down to millivolts.
Yep.
So it's not 50% the voltage.
No. There's almost nothing left
There's almost
compared to
nothing
what we
left.
started with.
So if you're using that, then your amp has to be able to take in a low voltage. I wonder if on this DAC, if we set it to bypass, if it's the same as 100.
You would think, but yeah.
Because I see that suggestion a lot from people. They say, well, why don't you just crank the volume all the way? It's the same thing. Well, I'm gonna hit the button. Let's see if it changes.
Oh, there's a.
Oh, hold on.
It did change, actually.
So it went
Very
down a
marginally.
little
It went
bit.
down slightly, yeah.
So you may get slightly additional gain by using a full.
But again, it depends on the DAC. So
Depends
this
on the
isn't
DAC, yeah.
universal.
Yeah.
So.
This DAC also has a different voltage setting as well. We'll leave it in bypass. Called, let's see, DAC out standard. We have it set to red, which is typical for home usage, but they have a pro setting. And right on the menu, it says for balanced, it changes the voltage out, but it doesn't give us the numbers for single-ended, so we're not going to know until we hit it. So
Whoa.
change to pro.
I got to change the scale over here.
So now we're
4
at
volts.
4 volts. So it basically from 2 to 4 volts we went from hitting that button. So
Which can be a big swing depending on what amp you're plugging it into.
well, especially single-ended.
Well, yeah.
I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
out
Well,
of
it's
a
double.
single-ended.
Yeah.
But so that's pretty good. So this is a hot little DAC we got here. So I'm not sure what the specs are, but at least at 888
Yeah.
hertz, that's how we're testing that. So I guess the next thing would be, how does it sound? Like, how does it change the sound when we do that? Like, what do you expect if we put too much voltage into the amp? How would you expect it to sound?
Well, usually the thing that's most noticeable is you could overload the input of the amplifier. And another confusing thing is it's quite variable at what point that happens. On some amplifiers, there's no output that you could get from the DAC that will overwhelm the amplifier. On other ones, they can be very sensitive. So it's fickle finding the right amount of voltage out versus whatever response you get out of the amplifier. Because sometimes they'll prefer more, sometimes they prefer less. Sometimes you need more because this signal, you can see as it gets louder going into the amplifier, they're often just amplifying it. So when you yell at the amplifier louder, usually it comes out louder. And that does not mean you get more power. It doesn't change the power output. It means you can maybe get more power if the signal wasn't loud enough before for it to amplify enough for it to hit its power limit. But it's a little bit past the scope of the video at the moment.
Well, I was just on a video call with Ray Samuels
Oh,
today.
yeah.
Because we have the B21 in house to evaluate, and he said all the way up to 12 volts. Go for it, full send.
Right. The manufacturers will usually put a specification on it. And Ray Samuels in particular, they're into power, so
Yeah.
that makes sense.
He said balanced, highest voltage you can get. What if the volume was too low out of the DAC? What do you think it would sound like?
Well, you wouldn't, depending on the headphone and amp, you wouldn't get enough volume out of your amp usually, and you're like, it would just be cranked, and then that's it. even though the amp may be rated to have enough power, you're not putting enough in to get enough out.
So just not enough volume, but is it going to like change the sound characteristics of the amp?
I don't know. Depends on the amp. You know?
Well, I feel like an amp probably has a sweet spot in the voltage that it's looking for. So like if you're dropping in and out of that, I would assume it sounds different. Like the THD numbers in particular, I know have to be set for a test environment.
Yeah,
right?
they're all yeah. The specs are all set at specific input voltage, and usually 1 kilohertz. We're doing a little bit off that, but whatever.
Yeah. Well, that also then gets really confusing too, because then it depends on the headphone.
Well,
Because the
yeah,
headphone, depending on what headphone you have plugged into it, it could be
right.
operating a different power.
I guess that's why this is confusing because every step of the chain matters.
Yeah.
So
So really, it depends. Well, depending on what headphone you might have to just try again, like every time you plug in something else.
yeah,
Well,
because it could be
reset
fine
it.
for one.
We
and
talked
not.
about this in other videos, but this is sort of the biggest issue with specifications. It's not necessarily that there are standards or the standards aren't sufficient. It's too complicated to understand every environment possible. So as a result, the specifications that any of these pieces of gear tell you don't necessarily translate into the experience you're going to get. So if they say a specific power or voltage or THD, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what you're going to see or achieve in your setup. And in fact, usually you won't. Usually be somewhere around there. Could be better, could be worse. You would expect and anticipate they're always going to show you the best stats they can, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes they just pick something that's an industry standard.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that they think this is a sensible way to portray it, but it won't be how it's used in your setup. So unfortunately, it's all dynamic and it's complicated. And it's hard to say exact specifics, which is why for this specific example of picking an output level, trying it kind of is the way to go. And if you can't hear a difference, then that's all you need to know.
One thing that I'd heard, and I've never seen tested though, is I've heard that some DACs, even though they have like a single-ended and a balanced out, that you shouldn't have both connected at the same time. And I've heard that difference, but I don't really know why. Like what's going on there that potentially.
Right. So this is a piece of test gear, and this is designed specifically to have as little load as possible as what you're connecting it to. And the reasoning for that is so it doesn't interact, doesn't change what the device you're testing is doing. Amplifiers aren't really designed with that in mind. They're designed to be plugged into one unit typically. And so they have more flexibility over how they do that. And some of them pose an actually somewhat significant load to the DAC. So if you plug two in, it could pull the voltage, it could pull the output down. And you
Gotcha.
could get issues. You could get distortion, you could get reduced output level.
Yeah.
And potentially, theoretically, in some rare situations, you could overload or overwhelm the output circuitry on this. Because this basically is an amplifier on the output. So it's like plugging two headphones in, kind of.
Yeah.
They're usually
Yeah.
more tolerant.
Amps are
to
like that
but-
too, though. Yeah, because like it's the same problem. Because if you have like a 4-pin and a dual 3-pin on the amp, and you plug two headphones in, that could be 20 ohms each, and then now you got a 10 ohm load that the amp was never designed for a headphone. And it's like, well, but it might not like that.
So we can just test that though, because we have this plugged in. And even though, so the single-ended is presenting no load, well, actually we'd have to have a second load here plugged in, wouldn't we? But I mean, if we just unplug it and it changes, that would be a pretty easy indicator, right? We got the left channel, I think.
Yeah, we could see if it does anything.
I just unplugged the right.
No, it didn't do anything.
So it's not changing anything.
No.
So this DAC is likely set up to just be able to plug in two things and leave it. Probably.
Probably. Depends
Yeah.
how tolerant the output circuitry is on the DAC.
Yeah.
But yeah, you'll get ranges all over the place. And we could probably find a specific example that
Yeah.
would be really severe. Because I've heard it before at a show.
Yeah.
Where you had two things plugged in and it gets screwy. There's distortion typically.
I would think that should probably be, that's an important feature of a DAC.
Yeah.
Because that's a selling point. Most DACs have, 6 different inputs,
Right.
these different things.
Yeah, yeah. For
But it's like,
versatility.
if you can only plug in one,
Right.
then
Not
what does it
ideal.
all matter?
Yeah, right. Why does it have all these inputs
Right.
or outputs?
And outputs, yeah. So,
Tends to be poorly documented as well. So hard to know if you can or not
And-
without asking the manufacturer.
that's a rough way to find out.
Yeah.
Purchasing it, bringing it home, plugging it into both your
expect
amps.
it to do something.
Yeah.
That just sucks. All right, so we've tested that. Should we try listening? See if we can hear it, make it sound bad?
Sure.
You got your source plugged into it.
Yep. We are playing a premium source right now. I'll change it over some music.
We switched over to music now from our 888 hertz test tone. And what song are we playing?
I don't know, some
It was
Daft Punk
Daft
song.
Punk
Yeah.
off Random Access Memories. Everybody knows that album, I hope.
Mhm.
And we're gonna try testing out what it sounds like when we change the volume of either. And the first test we had was maxing out the volume on the Broadway. So we're gonna do that. And then we're gonna turn down the volume all the way of the DAC. And then we're gonna listen to when we can first hear sound. And it looks like we're getting
Just about nothing.
just about
A few
nothing.
millivolts.
6 millivolts of audio. So I'm going to slowly crank it. I'm at about 10, 11, 12, 13, 18, 19, 20. Is it playing music?
Well, it was on a different track. It was on the intro.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's on the intro. So I'm starting to hear it around 26, 28 on the amp. And it's essentially not changed at
Yeah.
all.
We're just
So
seeing
it's still
noise.
very low.
It's just,
Yeah.
we don't have a refined setup for doing this, but
Yeah.
it's not a lot.
So also we're using the balanced out. So presumably it's double.
Yeah.
So, but with the amp at full, at about 75 on the DAC, it's too loud. So,
Now we're around 20 millivolts.
yeah.
Obviously, it's dynamic because it's music. So
Right.
So not
Test tone.
not a lot of room in there.
And then you can go the other way.
So now we're gonna turn the DAC down all the way. We're gonna turn the amp down all the way, and the DAC all the way up
The other way.
100.
Yeah.
And now we're gonna try the.
Oh, and instantly it's like, it's fine. Like, there's a fine listening volume right there. So that's like,
5% or something.
yeah. Yeah.
So neither. Yeah.
And then it's like painful at 5 o'clock. So, so you might want to turn it down actually from that, but it will work fine, at least with this headphone. More efficient headphones, it might be a bigger problem. You know, like when we listened to that Zeos headphone, remember that with the Broadway?
Right.
It was actually a problem where it was like,
Oh, I touched the
oh,
volume.
it's too much.
Yeah.
So you might actually want to lower it. But yeah, with the Diana TC, you could leave it at 100 and it's fine with this setup.
Yeah. But, well, you can leave the DAC at 100.
Right.
But
well,
then-
yeah, you couldn't.
But it's
run
not
the-
functional.
Well, yeah.
So
Yeah.
you'd have to find a sweet spot between the two of those because
Well,
there's
yeah.
no way you can listen regularly like that.
Well, yeah.
I
but
mean, they both sound about the same.
yeah,
though.
it's probably not much in it for sound, but yeah, it depends on which one you want to, how much volume you want to have to control.
Yeah. So at least with the Broadway, it seems like it's pretty tolerant
Yeah.
to voltage ranges, and you're really just trying to find a sweet spot in how you're listening. Yeah, we're what?
yeah, there's a lot going on. Right now, it's at half a volt or so, but it was going peaks over 0.8 or so.
Right. So I think we're probably looking at having it somewhere around 75, and then using the volume on the amp, probably.
Get a little more dynamic range out of it.
I mean, that is pretty punchy.
Yeah.
No, it's a little too. Need a little bit more. Okay. So I have the DAC at 80, and then the amp I can go 75, 80%. Sounds good, pretty dynamic. So I think on this stack, to my preference, I would probably go 80 on the DAC, and then use the volume control on the amp.
Yeah, because then you have like the full range
Yeah.
of the volume knob.
I mean, this DAC does also have an analog volume control option. What do we have? We're using analog. So digital might offer some refined control. And I did forget about the Pro setting, so I'm going to try that as well. See if... Yeah, so the Pro setting just kind of brings it back to what it was before.
Yeah, right.
So I'm going to turn that down a little bit. Start at 60. Yeah, I think I like the red version better. I think there's actually a sound difference. Yeah, so for whatever reason on the setup, I think I like the red version, setting the DAC to 80 and then using the volume control. Do you want to see if you hear a difference between pro and red?
Sure.
Oh, of course, the track's going to end. Testing this stuff is complicated.
Sometimes.
We could mess with this for hours and still not have like really solid conclusions.
Yep, you need like 20 different amps too. Because unfortunately, the conclusion depends on everything.
I don't know. There's not much in it. The problem is you gotta like volume match them. I think it's because you can't get it exactly. Is why they
Right,
sound
yeah.
different, but
Yeah, maybe.
it's pretty similar.
All right,
Yeah.
well, so the answer for me on this setup with the Dyna TC is I would use the DAC in its red mode with a variable volume control, which is non-bypass in this instance, and I would set it to around 80, and then I would use the Broadway to change the volume. And if you have any other stack, you basically have to go through this.
Right.
Turn the DAC all the way down, turn the amp all the way up, see how it sounds, see how it works.
Yeah, and the headphone would obviously be a big difference because if you had this is a relatively inefficient headphone. If you had an efficient headphone, yeah, this is all right out the window.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean,
everything
like,
would matter.
for the stuff that we sell,
Right.
if you have the KDAC and the Broadway with a TC or a DZ, you just max the KDAC and use the Broadway. Right?
Yeah.
That's
That's
pretty much
usually how we use
the
it,
standard
yeah.
way to do it.
Right.
But the MR, I actually do like to turn the KDAC down a
Yeah.
little bit and then turn the Broadway up a little bit.
Well, it also could just be something as simple as depending on how you have them stacked, you just want one that's so you can rest your hand on the table and control it, and so you use whichever one's on the bottom.
Yeah.
But it's up to you.
Yeah, I think I'd prefer to, in most instances, I'd probably prefer to have the DAC because of that for comfort or the preamp or whatever. So yeah, but then when you change headphones, you're going to have to do it again.
Right.
Turn the DAC all the way down, turn the amp all the way up, and then you just kind of do both until you get it right to
Or
how you like
you
it the way
just
it
have
sounds.
the DAC put out max power and just deal with the volume control on and the amp.
Yeah, I mean, that would probably be ideal, I think. If the DAC was a fixed output and the amp could handle it,
Right.
and you had nice range on the volume control so you could actually enjoy it.
Well, that's why they usually got gain switches. I guess that would solve that problem. It's like, switch into
Yeah,
low
we didn't
gain.
even talk about gain.
Yeah, right.
You know, that does more there too.
Right.
So yeah, do you think that's the answer?
Well, personally, I like having a sensible volume range on the knob of the amp.
Right.
I think that's reasonable because sometimes you're just cracking in and it's too loud. Other times you're hammered all the time. So having it so they're like you're middle of the way, maybe like 2/3 or so, and it's a good listening level, that tends to be more comfortable because it maximizes how much you could turn the knob to get the volume just right. It makes it easier to set the volume the way you want it. And to me, that tends to matter more than the differences I've noticed. However, there's certainly times where you have issues where it's too loud or too quiet going into the amp. And obviously in those situations, sometimes it's hard to know what's happening, but having an understanding of what the DAC can do and is capable of, I think is helpful to understand if there's something obvious like that that's happening. But beyond that, there tends to be a pretty wide range where it'll work fine.
Yeah.
Just preference to some extent.
In our example, unfortunately, both of these devices are extremely tolerant to each
Right.
other.
Yeah.
Right.
So really, you just pick which knob you want to use and get it to a range where you can have enjoyable listening both ways. But you could have a stack that doesn't have really good synergy, in which when you're at the low, like you have a lot of volume control, but at the lower end it sounds thin and terrible, or at the higher end it's clipping. So like you will find some natural limits either way.
Yeah.
Or if you have a stepped attenuator, like you probably don't want to use that as your volume control. You probably want to find that fixed
Well, yeah.
on the one that's click.
Right.
Step attenuator is when it's like
It's
click, click,
click,
click,
click,
click, click, click, click, click.
And sometimes
in
they don't
general.
have a lot of adjustment. So it
Right.
could be helpful to get so that the volume going into the amp is just right. So you're pretty close and you don't need to worry about it as
Yeah.
much.
That is why a lot of manufacturers offer both.
Yeah.
So you can pick one or the other because some people don't like stepped attenuators. Some people love them, pros
Yeah,
and
my
cons.
first GSX Mini was stepped.
Yeah.
And I actually went to the the cheaper one.
Yeah.
'Cause I wanna use that
Mine
for the
isn't
volume
step to
control.
attenuator. You don't have the step to attenuator either, right? Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it feels nice, but I don't like using it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That one, for some reason, it's like jarring too.
Yeah.
Like each step is.
Yeah.
A lot of times you get like a pop or a shock when you change it. Yeah.
I don't know your part. So yeah, so I think that's the answer. If they're both variable, you just kind of find the sweet spot for the volume control you want to use. Be mindful if it's too high and you're hearing clipping, that's your limit on that device, and then use the other one. And at the low end, could be thin, or if your stack is set and it works well, just use the volume control you want and set
Well,
the
there's
width of it.
one more thing that I just thought of that is kind of on this topic, and that is, I don't know about the newest stuff, but years ago we ran into a problem with running portables, and you would crank them and they would clip themselves. So it would just be clipped already. It wouldn't be clipping the input of the amp,
Yeah.
but the device would be clipped, so it would just be sending a clip signal.
Yeah.
That's a different problem, but kind of the same kind of thing. But
Yeah, some of these portables, when you start seeing it rated in milliwatts
yeah,
or millivolts or something, they're not going to run full-size headphones. Like, they might make volume,
right.
but the whole thing is going to not work right. So, yeah. So there you have it. Do this with
Well,
the knobs. Find the sweet spot.
And unfortunately, as per usual, there's no simple answer. You gotta try it.
It's pretty easy though.
Yeah.
Pretty low risk. So generally speaking, just change it, see if you notice the difference. If you don't, put it somewhere sensible in the middle or whatever, and it's probably fine.
And if you're at home and you're struggling with it, call us, email us. I'm here. I can help with it. If you have this stuff, I'll get this stuff out. I'll do it with you. Give me a test track, and I'll tell you how it sounds. Thanks, everybody. Be well.